Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. My name is Drew. I'm an accredited exercise physiologist and registered Chinese medicine practitioner. I specialize in exercise rehabilitation using a combination of Eastern movement practices such as yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong, pranayama, in conjunction with a kind of modern understanding of exercise science, strength and conditioning, rehabilitation techniques. It's really kind of designing bespoke rehabilitation programs to help people recover from accident and injury. And today we're going to be looking at, in this video, passive insufficiency. And we're going to be using this excellent learning tool, Muscles and Motion. So jump on over to their website and grab yourself a subscription. Well worth it. And let's get stuck straight in, shall we? So today I'm using the yoga app and we're in the theory section and we're looking at passive insufficiency. So yoga app, a theory section, under core asanas, you'll find this video here. So I'm just going to be touching on a small part of the instructional piece in this muscle motion app. So definitely encourage you to jump in and check it out. So what is passive insufficiency? Let me just shrink me a little bit. Let me blow this up a bit more. There we go, that's much better. So when you've got a two joint muscle, so for example, the hamstring is a two joint muscle, okay, or a biarticular muscle, bi meaning two, articular is joint, so two joint muscle. So hamstrings cross the knee joint and the hip joint particularly. And so when you get a muscle and it lengthens or is stretched to its full range of movement, so its full length, then it can restrict the joint from moving further. And so if you're too tight or too restricted for whatever reason, then your movement at the joint is limited. And then it requires compensation from other areas of the body if you want to take that movement further. So for example, here we're looking at the hamstring and looking at the knee joint and the hip joint. And you can see here, this is hip flexion, and you've got the hamstring here is fully stretched. So from the ischial tuberosity where the hamstring attaches at the hip down onto the tibial plateau and the head of the fibula. So head of the fibula here is where your bicep femoris attaches onto there. So you can see that the muscle is quite stretched. Now, if you wanted to bring this leg up higher, you'd need more range of movement in this muscle here. So depending on your flexibility, if you've got a tight hamstring, if you're trying to, like, for example, kick, so this is like a classic kicking posture, this tight hamstring here is going to restrict the movement at the hip joint and at the knee joint. So if you try to bring the leg through higher, then something's going to give. And typically what will happen is you'll get a slight knee bend to take tension off the hamstring, and or you'll get slight kind of rounding of the spine, as in instead of that nice lordotic curve there, it'll go more into a flex curve there. So then you'll get changes in the pelvis, and then you'll also get changes at the knee joint. So let's just let it play through a bit more. So for example, so that's going to be your full hip range of movement here. So you can see the full range is really where the femur is contacting with the actual bony structures of the pelvis. It might be here, or the ridge there on the pelvis, or up higher on the ilium there. Just depends on people's different structure. But generally that end range of movement is going to be where the bones stop any more movement. So here, for you to get that full range, you'd have to be able to get that hamstring to lengthen further so to accommodate that range of movement. So that would be passive insufficiency. So if you're trying to get your leg up here onto your chest, but your hamstrings are too tight, then you're not going to be able to make it, and you're going to have to compensate somewhere else. So you got inability to complete the full range of movement. So here, what happens is the knee bends. That takes tension off that hamstring, okay? And that allows you to bring the knee up closer to your chest. So if you do yoga and you're doing like a seated forward fold posture, okay, one of the cues we have is to unlock your knees, like you're sitting on your tailbone, unlock your knees, and then bring your chest towards your knees, but maintain that lumbar arch. So keep your chest up and then lean forward, and you'll get a nice hamstring stretch at the hip joint. And then once you can feel that hamstring stretch at the hip joint, then you slowly try to straighten your legs out. But if you feel you're compromising your posture, then you stop there. And that's how you adapt the hamstring posture or the hamstring stretch to the person's individual range of movement. Or you bend your knees up higher if you want to get into the chest. So depending on your goal, if you're really aiming to get very, very flexible, okay, this is something you'll need to work on. So if you're sitting with your legs out straight here, okay, and you can't get your legs fully straight, so imagine you're like doing a seated hamstring stretch, you need to then bend the knees. Now, how you increase your flexibility is still being debated in the literature a fair bit, but essentially what happens is if the muscle themselves aren't strong enough to resist the forces that are going through the muscle, okay, the muscle typically at a kind of neurological level won't allow that extra range of movement because it's not going to be strong enough to negate all the various forces going into the joint, in connective tissues, into the bone, into the muscle themselves. And so often that's where potential injury or wear and tear type conditions occur, where you're exceeding the functional range of movement. So for a muscle to go out fully lengthened requires some component of strength with it as well. So once you've kind of grown past your kind of formative years in the kind of late teens, early 20s, where your skeletal structure is really kind of basically grown into its shape, okay, then you can definitely train into your body's kind of structure itself. So meaning if you do a lot of dance, a lot of yoga, a lot of martial arts when you're younger, you'll train these muscles to be really long and pliable as you're growing into your body. But if you're someone who's a bit older, like in their mid-20s, early 30s, and you try to start doing training to increase your flexibility, it's going to take a lot more work because essentially the long-term flexibility is increase in sarcomere length. So it's in like the actual growing longer of the muscle. Because if it was just a matter of sliding the muscles across each other, which is part of flexibility, then that should be pretty simple to do. But to get from this range of movement to here, but with your leg straight, there's a lot more flexibility that's required across this hamstring. So passive insufficiency is going to be a big restrictor. And we see that a lot in people starting out in their movement practices, whether it's yoga, whether it's Pilates, whether it's a strength conditioning program, because really movement is movement. The body principles are pretty much universal in all the practices, just the methods are slightly different. People often to be very stiff and tight, particularly in Western culture. In Western culture, we do a lot of sitting. We don't do as much physical work in our occupation and our jobs anymore. So people tend to be a lot more tighter, a lot more stiffer, a lot more restricted. And so they need to spend a little more time kind of paying attention to their range of movement, so their mobility. So being able to move their joints through these full range positions. Really, really important, because if you can't get the joint through the full range, what you'll see here is we'll get into some compensatory patterns. So here's a beautiful example here. So this is like a hinge movement. So like a RDL or a deadlift movement from the standing position. Here we have the hamstrings. They've got this little animation of this guy pulling the muscles to kind of help visualize that. Here we have the ischial tuberosity, so that's on the bottom of the pelvis. Here we have the knee insertions here. That little bone there, that's the head of the fibula. And so if you pull this muscle down this way, it's going to pull this bone here downward. The pivot point here is the acetabular joint where the femur goes in the socket. And so if you keep this whole torso stiff, so abdominals brace, back extensors brace, so this whole back unit stays basically stiff, so it moves as one, what you'll get is a hip extension movement to there, bang. So that's your deadlift, that's your hinge. It's a really, really important movement to be able to do. And you can see that that hamstring pulled back that down to create that movement or to help create that movement. So hinge forward. Now you see here, this muscle gets stretched out. So this is actually one of the best ways to increase your flexibility is to practice hinging with a nice neutral spine. Now, as this image will demonstrate, if you try to go further than that, what's going to happen is you're going to get some compensation in the lower back here. So you're going to lose that nice lordotic arch in the lumbar spine. So remember, neutral spine for most people has a lordosis or an arch in it. Here we flatten out, and you can notice here that the discs are getting compressed. So on the front, they're quite pinched together. On the back, they're kind of more in this triangle shape. So this forward flexion under load is one position where potentially you can injure the spine. And a lot of back mechanisms of injury is bending forward with a slight twist, because you're putting all the load, instead of going into the hamstrings and the butt muscles, they're going down into these individual segments. So the load transfer changes. In advanced movement, you train to be able to stand up with flex spine. We'll do another video on that in the future. And that's really advanced exercise training. And you see that in yoga, you see that in Pilates, you see that in gymnastic strength training, you see it in functional strength training as well. So it's functional movement. So if you want to be able to touch your toes, you can either do it to straight back if you've got really good hamstring flexibility, or you need to compensate. So if you don't want to get pressure into your lumbar spine here, because often people will feel this pressure here because you're putting a load there, one way to kind of correct it is to flex the knees. So you'll see here in a second, you'll get a nice knee flexion here to take the load out. So you come back up into spine, bend the knees, polis there. And here you have this nice neutral spine. This is where your core is really important, because there's nothing between the ribs and the hips here except the spine. Oh, come back. So you need all your ab muscles on. Load's being held here by this nice hamstring and the butt muscles, and the back extensors through here. So when you hinge, you tip forward with this nice kind of crown to tailbone line to get this hinge through the hamstrings. Super, super important. And then as you get more flexible, as in the hamstrings get eccentrically lengthened, so they're stretching under load, which means they're getting stronger as you're stretching them, you'll be able to go further and deeper into this forward fold position or hinge position. So the trick is when you're training people, and it doesn't matter if it's in yoga world, if it's in Pilates world, if it's in strength conditioning world, you train people to hinge with their neutral spine, okay, to the point where they get that nice hamstring stretch, and there's no excessive pressure in your lumbar spine. The lower back muscle is going to be active, so you're going to feel something, but there's a definite different sensation to between stabilizing versus all the load going into your lower back, which is not fun. So beautiful expression there of a hinge. Now leg goes out straight, bend the knee, and bring it up. And here we have another example. So if we flip around now, we're going into the quad muscle, rectus femoris, attaching at the hip joint here and on the knee. So the two balls here, the two axis points or the two joints. So if you've got a tight quad, back a little bit. If you have a tight quad, so this is full range of movement of the knee. So where the calcaneus, that's your heel bone, basically goes onto your butt, and you physically can't go any further. Okay, so if you can kneel on the ground, so shin flat on the floor, and then sit on your tailbone, okay, you've got full bend in the knee. So that's one of the key goals I have with my knee rehab clients, is we want to be able to kneel on your knees. Because that way I know you've got full range of movement at the knee, okay, passively, meaning you're not using any muscles. It's just the joint being able to flex in that load. Now, if you've got tight quadricep muscles here, for example, so the rectus femoris is here, maybe this is as far as this muscle will allow you to go because that's its length. Okay, then you've got all this range here that you need to catch up with. And so the only way to kind of do that is to slowly build up the strength in the quadricep muscle group with eccentric loading. So you're going to be doing things like lunges, particularly, and going down as deep as you can, knees over toes to the front, but working this back leg to get the nice big hip stretch. You want to go down slow, get the eccentric load, because when the muscle's stretching under load, that's eccentric loading. That's the best way to get the muscle stronger and more flexible, because you're doing it with control, and the body will adapt over time to that range of movement. So there's no kind of like cheating, if you will. It's just a really good way of doing it. So there's this nice diagram here, and this is the compensation. So you get the big back arch. So when people are doing, for example, in yin yoga, we have a move in yin yoga called saddle. So imagine you're on your back and you're lying down your back and you've got this foot kind of tucked under. And for me, I can't do saddle. Like it just gets this big arch in my lower back and it just really is uncomfortable. So this is a movement that I can't access. Even though I've done heaps and heaps and heaps of quad stretching, I can definitely get my heel to my butt in kneeling, but when I'm trying to add in the hip flexors and the rectus femoris, I'm super tight in those two muscle groups, so I just can't access this one. And that's most likely as a result of 20 years of teaching indoor cycling classes. So my cardio is teaching spin classes or participating in cycling, indoor cycling. 45 minutes to an hour on the bike 3 to 4 times a week is just the best cardiovascular training. And I do that because it's really joint friendly, but like everything in life, there's a trade-off, and the trade-off is cycling tends to create very tight quads and tight hip flexors because the range of movement in the cycling is always the same, essentially. So, and it's never to full range. So you're getting really tight, really strong and quite well developed leg muscles, but they're in a very specific range of movement. So you're never going through the full range of movement. So I do a lot of kind of mobility training to compensate for that, but I just haven't been able to access this. And that's fine because, to be honest, you don't need that full range of movement in every day-to-day life. It's cool if you can do it, but it's not something you have to be able to do. It's not a must-have. You definitely need to be able to bend your knee all the way to here, and you definitely need to be able to sit on your heels, but you don't need this full range of movement like lying on your back, lying all the way down on the floor with the knee bend to a saddle type pose. That's pretty excessive, and there's not much more benefit there. So here, this is a great example of how to stretch this quad. So you come into more neutral, you use your anterior core here to brace the belly. So you're maintaining the pelvic position. Then you use your hand or a rope for a lever to get into that quad stretch. So when you're doing your lunges, your heel elevated lunges, you try to maintain this hip position or control it. So there will be some natural lumbar extension, but it'll be a controlled way. And then you just sink that rear knee down, you get the nice stretch, up you go. So that's the kind of trick there. So you will definitely get that kind of anterior tilt compensation, bang, into there. And here you're going to be compressing all the discs in the lumbar spine. This is another reason why we tend to start, or my method of teaching people is always starting with breathing technique and then kind of like organizing of the spine, so posture, which really integrates with kind of abdominal bracing and just using your core musculature. So you can organize your hips, your knees, your ribs, your spine in the right positions and when you're trying to perform each movement. And if you can do that and then execute each movement following your breath and your natural movement, you can kind of have a longevity in your training. And the mindset goes from I'm trying to get into a really deep squat or a forward fold or a splits or whatever, where you're trying to get to the really big end range flexibility movements, which are cool if you can do them, but they're not really that necessary. But can you control the movements to the full ranges which your body actually requires to do to navigate in the real world? So that's the kind of more the method I have in my training and then the clients who I train with. And what's good about it is it creates longevity. You need to be patient to do it, so there's no quick fixes. But once you learn how to use and integrate all these body positions, things just work better. You get out of pain, movements are much more improved, and life is just more enjoyable when you're not in pain, you don't have restriction. Okay, so that's enough of the passive insufficiency. In the next video, we'll look at active insufficiency. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts, drop them down in the comments below. Always happy to answer them. Wherever you are, keep studying, keep learning, keep training, stay curious, stay humble, and we'll see you for the next video. Cheers.